The entire kitchen fell silent, the moment the health inspector walked through the door. Not the nervous kind of silence that happens when someone important enters a room. The other kind, the kind where people exchange glances and look away too quickly, where the sous chef suddenly finds something urgent to study on his clipboard, where even the dishwasher in the back slows down his rhythm, like he doesn't want to draw attention to himself. And then came the laughter. It started with one of the culinary judges. A man named Bradford Ellis, the kind of man who wore his credentials like a second suit, who leaned toward his colleague and whispered something behind a cupped hand. Whatever he said, the woman beside him covered her mouth. The third judge, seated at the far end of the table, didn't even bother to hide it. He just shook his head slowly, the way people do when they've already decided something before it begins. Standing at the pass-through window of the smallest, oldest kitchen in the Hargrove Grand Hotel's underground exhibition hall, a man named Wesley Holt wiped his hands on a clean dish towel and watched them laugh. He didn't say anything, he didn't move, he just watched, the way a person watches weather, knowing it's coming, knowing there's nothing to do but wait it out. The competition hadn't even started yet. Wesley Holt had spent 22 years cooking in places most people in this industry would never admit to visiting, not the restaurants with the vaulted ceilings and the 18-course tasting menus. Not the hotels with Michelin stars mounted near the entrance, like trophies from a different era. Wesley cooked in a school cafeteria in Denton, Texas, 312 days a year, serving lunch to 480 kids between the ages of 6 and 14. He knew every allergy on the roster. He remembered which third grader couldn't eat tree nuts, and which seventh grader had been quietly skipping lunch because her family was going through something nobody talked about directly. And so he started packing a little extra in the portions for the kids at her table, without ever making it a thing. That was Wesley. He was always making things not a thing. He was 43 years old. He had a son named Eli. The file said Eli, but here his name is different, so a son named Dorian, 9 years old, with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn habit of reading the back of every cereal box before committing to breakfast. Dorian had been with Wesley full-time for 4 years now, since the morning the hospital called, and Wesley drove 35 miles, without remembering a single traffic light. His wife's name was Claire. She died in February, the kind of February that feels like it lasts 6 weeks too long, from a condition that moved too fast for anyone to feel prepared. Wesley had been 39 then. He had a restaurant consultation business that was just beginning to gain traction. A small but growing reputation among independent restaurant owners in North Texas, and a marriage that he had always privately considered the best decision he ever made in a life full of decent decisions. Then Claire was gone, and then the clients stopped calling, because grief has a way of making a person unreliable in small ways that add up quickly. He missed a deadline here. He arrived late there. He showed up to a kitchen consultation in the same shirt he'd worn the day before, and the owner noticed, and word travels in this industry the way smoke travels, quietly, everywhere, through every crack. Within 14 months, the business was dormant. The savings were absorbed by medical bills, and the ordinary devastation of being a single parent, in a country where everything costs more than it should. Wesley sold the consultation van, the specialized equipment, the commercial knife set Claire had given him for his birthday the year before she got sick, wrapped in brown paper with a note that said, "For the career you deserve." He kept the note. He took the cafeteria job because it was consistent, because the hours matched Dorian's school schedule, because the benefits were real, and the people were kind, and nobody expected him to be more than present. He was good at it. Genuinely, seriously good in ways that went unnoticed by everyone except the kids, who can always tell when food was made by someone paying attention versus someone going through motions. But every night after Dorian went to bed, Wesley stood in the kitchen of their rental house in Denton and cooked alone. Old techniques, difficult preparations, dishes he'd learned from his grandmother in her house in Shreveport, Louisiana. Recipes that existed only in her handwriting on index cards, that smelled faintly like the drawer she kept them in, which smelled like cardamom and old wood. He cooked because it was the only time the day got quiet inside him. Not quiet like emptiness, quiet like water that has finally stopped moving. He had entered the Hargrove Culinary Invitational. on a dare from one of the lunch monitors at the school. A woman named Patrice, who had once eaten Wesley's chicken and dumplings at the staff holiday potluck, and spent the following week asking everyone why this man was serving tater tots to 11-year-olds instead of running a restaurant. When the application for the invitational arrived in her email, she subscribed to culinary event newsletters for reasons she couldn't fully explain. She forwarded it to Wesley with no message, just the forward. He almost deleted it. The Hargrove Culinary Invitational was not a casual competition. It was one of the most respected culinary showcases in the American South, held annually in the ballroom and exhibition kitchens of the Hargrove Grand Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee. The judges included Bradford Ellis, whose syndicated food column ran in 42 markets. The prizes included a feature profile in Southern Table magazine, a cash award of $25,000, and the part that kept Wesley awake 3 nights running after he read it. The opportunity to present a signature dish concept to the board of Hargrove Hospitality Group, which owned 14 hotels across 7 states, and had recently announced plans to overhaul the culinary programming at all of them. It was the kind of opportunity that could change a person's trajectory so completely that the before and after would feel like 2 separate lives. Wesley applied. He almost didn't. He sat at the kitchen table with the application on his laptop screen for 40 minutes, before Dorian wandered out in his pajamas for a glass of water, looked at the screen, and said, in the tone of a 9-year-old who has absorbed more adult conversation than he lets on, "You should just do it, Dad." Wesley did it. He arrived at the Hargrove Grand Hotel the morning of the invitational in a truck that needed new brake pads, carrying his equipment in 2 canvas bags and a cooler he'd borrowed from his neighbor. He wore the chef's jacket he'd kept in the back of his closet since the consultation business, the one with his initials on the left breast pocket. WH, which now fit slightly differently than it used to because grief and cafeteria work had changed the shape of his shoulders in ways he hadn't consciously tracked. The lobby of the Hargrove Grand was the kind of lobby that exists specifically to make certain people feel welcome, and other people feel like they've wandered somewhere they don't belong. The chandelier alone was the size of Wesley's living room. The marble floors reflected the light in a way that made his work boots sound louder than they were. He found his assigned kitchen, Station 7, the smallest of the 8 exhibition kitchens in the basement-level competition hall, and began setting up. Around him, the other competitors moved through their spaces with the easy confidence of people accustomed to being taken seriously in rooms like this. One of them, a chef named Prescott Vane, who had trained in Lyon and ran a restaurant in Charleston that had a 4-month waitlist, paused on his way past Wesley's station and looked at the canvas bags and the borrowed cooler and kept walking without saying anything. The look said everything. Bradford Ellis arrived with the other judges at 10:15 and did a walkthrough of the stations before the competition began. When he reached Station 7, he stopped. He looked at the setup, he looked at Wesley, he looked back at the setup. "And what establishment are you representing?" Bradford asked, in the tone of a man who already suspected the answer and found it mildly amusing. "Denton Independent School District," Wesley said. "Cafeteria kitchen." The pause that followed was only 2 seconds long, but it had texture. Bradford let out a short sound, not quite a laugh, but adjacent, and moved on. The woman next to him, a food journalist named Alice Drummond, who covered the southern culinary scene for 3 regional publications, caught Wesley's eye for just a moment before she followed Bradford toward the next station. Her expression was difficult to read, but it wasn't the same expression as Bradford's. The competition had 6 rounds across 2 days. Each round required a different technique and a different protein or regional ingredient. Wesley worked quietly. He did not perform in the way some chefs perform. No theatrical flourishes, no announcing to the room what he was doing, no carefully constructed persona projected outward for the judges and the small rotating audience of hospitality journalists and hotel executives, who watched from behind a low rail. He just cooked, and slowly, almost reluctantly, people started watching. By the end of the first day, Wesley had placed 3rd in the first round, 2nd in the second, and 1st, by a margin that made Bradford Ellis reset his scoring paddle before he showed it. In the 3rd, Bradford's expression during that 3rd score reveal was not exactly anger, but it was its neighbor. The second day was when the story changed. The fifth round called for a dish, representing a culinary heritage, something rooted in a specific regional tradition, interpreted through the competitor's own voice. Most of the other chefs reached for French classical technique, for new American minimalism, for the kinds of approaches that photograph well and pair naturally with the language of food criticism. Wesley made his grandmother's gumbo. Not a refined interpretation. Not a deconstructed gesture toward the source material. He made the gumbo exactly as Ida May Holt had made it in her kitchen in Shreveport for 61 years, with the dark roux cooked until it was the precise color of an old penny, a color most culinary school curricula describe as dangerously close to burned, but which Ida May called ready, and the trinity of onions and celery and bell pepper, and the andouille she'd ordered from the same butcher every Christmas, and the file powder she kept in a small jar labeled in her own handwriting. Wesley had her index cards, he had her handwriting. He had stood in his rental kitchen in Denton, more times than he could count, and cooked from those cards, until his version was so close to hers that closing his eyes in that kitchen felt, briefly, like being somewhere else. Somewhere with cardamom and old wood, and a woman humming something without words, over a pot that was always simmering. The gumbo took 2 hours and 40 minutes to make correctly. He had exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes for the round. He worked without looking up. When Bradford Ellis first tasted it, standing over the bowl with the posture of a man preparing to be unimpressed, something shifted, not dramatically. Not in any way that would make a good moment for a television show. Just a small recalibration, visible only to someone paying close attention. He set his spoon down, he picked it up again, he tasted once more. He did not say anything for a long time. Alice Drummond, tasting beside him, set her own spoon down and looked at Wesley across the room, with an expression that was no longer difficult to read. The scores from round 5 came last. When Bradford read Wesley's number aloud, a 97 out of 100, the highest single-round score recorded at the Hargrove Invitational in 11 years, the room was not silent in the way it had been that first morning. This silence had different weight. The kind that happens when something unexpected lands and no one has figured out yet what to do with it. Prescott Vane, standing 2 stations over, stared at the scoreboard for a moment too long before looking away. The other competitors reacted in various ways. Some were gracious, a few were not. One woman, a chef from Memphis, named Darlene Fitch, who had been leading the competition through the first 4 rounds, walked over to Wesley's station during the break and said, quietly and without preamble, "That roux, how long did you cook it?" 41 minutes, Wesley said. She nodded, once, the nod of someone absorbing information they respect. My grandmother would have said 42, mine said 41, Wesley said. But she also said the difference between 41 and 42 was knowing your stove. Darlene Fitch almost smiled. Yeah, she said. That sounds right. It was the only real conversation Wesley had with another competitor across both days of the competition. The final round required each chef to present an original concept dish. Something that could become a signature item for a hotel restaurant. Something that told a story and worked at scale, and felt both distinctive and accessible. Wesley had been thinking about this round for weeks. He had cooked the dish 17 times in his rental kitchen in Denton, adjusting small things each time, until the 17th version felt inevitable, in the way that only a very few dishes ever do. It was a braised short rib, but the preparation was layered with the kind of patience that mass hospitality cooking rarely allows. A 48-hour process, started the day before the competition began, which the competition rules permitted for dishes requiring extended technique. The base was a reduction built on chicory coffee and dark molasses, and a small amount of the same dark roux philosophy that ran through Ida May's cooking like a spine. The garnish was a cornbread pudding, savory, slightly sweet, with texture that was soft without being yielding, and a bitter green salad dressed with a cane vinegar reduction that cut through the richness like a clean note at the end of a long chord. It was Southern food that didn't apologize for itself. It was food that knew where it came from. When the final scores were compiled, and Bradford Ellis stood at the front of the room to announce the Hargrove Invitational winner, he paused before he read the name. The pause was different from his earlier ones. This one wasn't dismissive. It was the pause of a man who had revised a conclusion he'd reached before the evidence was in. The winner of this year's Hargrove Culinary Invitational, Bradford said, is Wesley Holt. The room responded, applause from most, silence from a few, the kind of moment that contains everyone's different feelings about it simultaneously. Wesley stood at his station for a moment before moving. He thought about Dorian, home with his neighbor Patrice's sister who had agreed to babysit, probably watching cartoons on the couch, and eating the sandwiches Wesley had prepped and left in the fridge, labeled by meal. He thought about Claire, the way he always thought about Claire, in the moments when she would have been standing beside him. He thought about Ida May, and her index cards, and the kitchen that smelled like cardamom. He walked to the front of the room. What happened afterward was not what anyone had predicted, or rather, the people who had not been watching carefully. Bradford and Prescott, and the cluster of executives who had spent the first morning categorizing Wesley as a curiosity, had not predicted it. Alice Drummond had, at some point in the second afternoon, stopped being surprised. The presentation to the Hargrove Hospitality Group Board was scheduled for the following morning. Wesley had not prepared a slide deck. He had not prepared a presentation in the formal sense. He had prepared food. He walked into the boardroom on the 14th floor of the Hargrove Grand, with the same 2 canvas bags, and the same borrowed cooler and a hotel catering cart he'd been given use of the evening before. He sat up in the corner, while the 6 board members found their seats. None of them had seen his name before that morning. Their executive assistant had briefed them on the competition results, but facts about an event are different from understanding what the event produced. The board chair was a woman named Eleanor Voss. She ran Hargrove Hospitality Group with the kind of precision that organizational people sometimes describe as exacting, and workers in the actual buildings sometimes describe as terrifying. She had built the company's reputation through aggressive acquisition and an uncompromising standard for guest experience that filtered down to every department in every property. She was also, as of 18 months ago, the person most responsible for a quiet crisis the company had not yet figured out how to solve publicly. Every food and beverage outlet in the Hargrove portfolio was underperforming. Not catastrophically, not in ways that showed up in the headlines, but in ways that showed up in guest satisfaction surveys and repeat booking data, and the particular metric that Eleanor Voss tracked most closely: the number of guests who, when asked what they remembered most about their stay, mentioned the food. That number was declining, property by property, year by year, in the precise direction that the word declining suggests. Eleanor Voss had been trying to solve this problem through the traditional channels: consulting firms, celebrity chef partnerships, menu trend analysis, guest focus groups. The competition had been one small piece of a larger strategy, designed to surface undiscovered culinary talent who might bring something fresh to the portfolio. She had not expected the undiscovered talent to be a cafeteria cook from Denton, Texas. Wesley served the braised short rib. He served a version of the cornbread pudding he'd adapted for breakfast service, with a lightly sweet preparation that worked in a hotel dining room at 7 in the morning. He served a small bowl of a chicken and root vegetable soup that he described, briefly and without embellishment, as something he cooked for the kids in his cafeteria on cold days, a recipe that had evolved from his grandmother's hand, to his mother's kitchen, to his own, across 3 generations of women and one man who'd learned to pay attention. The board ate in a silence that was different from all the previous silences in this story. This one was concentrated, this one had work in it. Eleanor Voss tasted the soup last. She set her spoon down. She looked at Wesley across the table. "Tell me about the school," she said. So Wesley told her. He told her about Denton, and the 480 kids, and the girl who skipped lunch, until he started making the portions bigger at her table. He told her about Dorian and the 9 years of making lunch the best part of both their days. He told her about Claire, briefly, without performing the grief, in the way you mention someone who is permanently present, even when they are not in the room. He told her about Ida May's index cards, still in the drawer in his rental kitchen, smelling like cardamom and old wood. Eleanor Voss was not a person who visibly changed her expression in professional settings. But something shifted, the same small, unperformative shift that Bradford Ellis had shown over the bowl of gumbo, the recalibration, the revision. "You understand," she said, "that what we're describing here would be a significant undertaking. Developing a culinary identity across 14 properties is not a single-dish solution. I know, Wesley said. You'd be leaving a stable position. I know that too, with a 9-year-old at home. Wesley looked at her directly. I've been leaving everything I know for 4 years, he said. That part isn't new. What's new is that this time it might be going somewhere. Eleanor Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she looked down the table at the rest of the board, and whatever passed between them in that look was brief and conclusive. 3 weeks to Hargrove Hospitality Group announced the creation of a new culinary direction initiative for the company's 14 properties. The program was named the Cole Heritage Kitchen Project, named not for anyone in the Hargrove family, but for the culinary traditions passed down through family lines across generations, that Wesley Holt had been asked to lead the effort of honoring and translating into hotel dining that felt, for once, like it came from somewhere real. No, wait, that's the other story's naming convention. The program was named the Holt Table, a name Eleanor Voss suggested and Wesley initially resisted, on the grounds that something after yourself, before you've done the thing felt presumptuous. Eleanor told him, in the flat and direct way she communicated most things, that it wasn't named after him. It was named after the approach. The table as a place where people are fed with intention. He could argue the semantics later. Right now they had 14 kitchens to rethink from the ground up. Wesley accepted. He accepted on a Tuesday in November, in the same boardroom on the 14th floor, where he had cooked soup for people in suits, with Dorian on speakerphone during the signing because Wesley had promised his son he would call immediately regardless of the outcome, and Dorian had said okay, but call, even if it's good news too, don't just call if it's bad, and it turned out, in a way that still felt faintly impossible, that this time it was good. Dorian listened to Wesley explain what had happened and was quiet for a moment and then said, "So does this mean we're moving to Nashville?" "For a while," Wesley said. Another pause. "Does Nashville have good cereals?" Wesley told him Nashville had perfectly adequate cereal and that he would supplement accordingly. Bradford Ellis published his review of the Hargrove Invitational 2 weeks after the competition, in his syndicated column that ran in 42 markets. He described Wesley's gumbo as the most technically confident and emotionally intelligent dish he had tasted in 3 years of competition judging. He noted, without explicitly acknowledging his own first morning response, that the competition had demonstrated the particular danger of making assessments before the evidence is in. He gave it his highest rating. The one he usually reserved for restaurants with reservation waitlists, measured in months. Alice Drummond's piece, published in Southern Table magazine the same week, was longer and more direct. She wrote about the morning Bradford had whispered something to his colleague while standing in front of Station 7's. She wrote about Prescott Vane's expression during the round 5 scores. She wrote about the way the Hargrove Grand's exhibition hall had looked, for a few hours on a Tuesday, like a room that had organized itself around the expectation of failure, and then had to reorganize itself around something else entirely. She wrote about Wesley cooking alone in a rented kitchen in Denton, Texas, at midnight, from a dead woman's index cards, not for anyone, not for an audience. Just because the food mattered and the practice mattered, and some things you keep doing, not because they're working yet, but because they are the truest version of what you know how to do. She ended the piece by quoting something Wesley had said to her, briefly in the corridor, after the final scores were announced. When she'd asked him what had gone through his mind in the moment, Bradford called his name. He had thought about it for a few seconds. Then he said, "I thought about how long I'd been cooking towards something without knowing it. And I thought, okay, so this is what it was for." The first Holt Table restaurant opened at the Hargrove Grand Nashville, 11 months later, in the same building where a group of judges had laughed in a basement kitchen, and then spent the rest of the weekend quietly revising their understanding of what they were watching. Wesley designed the menu over 8 months of testing, sourcing, and 100 conversations with regional farmers and butchers, and the kinds of producers who have been doing what they do for decades without much fanfare. Because the fanfare was never the point. The menu changed seasonally. The cornbread pudding, in its savory lunch incarnation, and its sweeter morning version, appeared on both the dinner and breakfast menus, and became, within 3 months of opening, the item guests mentioned most frequently when asked what they remembered about the food. Dorian turned 10 in Nashville. Wesley made him his mother's birthday cake recipe. A yellow cake with chocolate frosting that Claire had made from memory because she'd never bothered to write it down, and that Wesley had reconstructed from memory. And 3 failed attempts in the months after she died, until the 4th attempt tasted the way 10 birthdays had tasted when they were the kind of family that had all 3 of them in the same kitchen at the same time. The cake was not on the Holt table menu. Some things are only for the people they were made for. There is something worth saying here, before this story ends. Not a lesson packaged for easy delivery, not a proverb or a summary, or a line designed to stay with you because it sounds right. Just an observation, from the outside looking in. Wesley Holt spent 4 years in a cafeteria kitchen in Denton, Texas, cooking for children who needed to be fed. He did it well. He did it better than the job required, which is how people like Wesley do things they believe in. The world did not arrange itself to notice, which is how the world usually works. Talent without an audience is still talent. A dish served well to 100 kids who won't remember your name is still a dish served well. Those things don't require an audience to be real. What the Hargrove Invitational did was not make Wesley a good cook. He already was. What it did was put him in a room where the evidence had no choice but to accumulate faster than the assumptions. Sometimes that's all it takes. Not luck exactly, not justice exactly, just the accumulation of evidence in a room where someone, eventually, is paying attention. If there has ever been a moment in your life when you kept doing the real thing in the absence of recognition, kept cooking at midnight, kept writing in notebooks no one reads, kept showing up to the work when the work wasn't applauding you back, then you already know the feeling Wesley had when he sat in that boardroom on the 14th floor and talked about Dorian and Ida Mae and Claire. The feeling that you were always cooking toward something. You just didn't know yet what room it was going to be in.